Common space modeling requirements for the California Multifamily New Homes program. We have a few great panelists for you today. Speaking is Shannon Todd with the California Multifamily New Homes program. I think we're ready to move into just a kind of introduction to the program, and then we'll segue into the rest of our content. Next slide. Okay, so the California Multifamily New Homes program is sponsored by PG&E, and all folks that participate in the program, or all projects that participate in the program, must receive service from PG&E. And all incentives that are offered to participants are offered on behalf of Pacific Gas and Electric Company. Next slide. Okay, so a little bit about who you're hearing from today. TRC Energy Services, we implement CMFNH, we call it for short. We implement CMFNH on behalf of PG&E and do a few other things as well. We have a lot of expertise in codes and standards, so as we're all gearing up for the new Title 24, you can feel free to approach us if you have questions. That's a big part of our work in this program, is helping participants feel prepared for next code cycles. We also do research on emerging technology and zero net energy, and we do this work throughout the country for all kinds of programs for utilities and other clients. Next slide. So a little bit about California Multifamily New Homes. If you're on this webinar, you've probably worked with the program before. You know that we provide incentives for developers and energy consultants who participate in the program to motivate energy efficient design. We also provide trainings, and we do coordinate with other programs like the New Solar Homes Partnership and Build It Green and other utility programs in Southern California. And the real goal of the program is to support folks who are involved in multifamily developments to just improve their design and learn what more they can do in a cost-effective way to improve efficiency in their projects. Next slide. So eligibility, as I mentioned before, participating projects must receive either electricity or gas from PG&E. And if you're kind of on a fringe area, we're happy to coordinate if there's an equivalent program, an equivalent multifamily program, or sorry, an equivalent, if the other utility is providing service, if they also have a program, we're happy to coordinate with them. It's kind of a mouthful. So building types, it has to be a new construction project. So if it's going down to if it's a rehab project that's going down to really just a full deconstruction, it could participate in CMFNH. But for the most part, we see new construction projects, apartments and condos. If you're working on a duplex or a townhome, it would most likely go through the single family program. So in terms of energy performance, there is a minimum threshold for participants. You need to at least achieve 15% above the 2013 Title 24 standards, or for low-rise projects, we have an alternate option, which is this CMFNH score. You have to meet a score of at least 84 or lower. And completed construction by December 31st, 2019. If you're working on a project that's past that deadline, let us know. There might be some flexibility, but that's kind of our standard deadline. Next slide. Okay, so incentives. So we think of our incentives in kind of two categories. Developers receive incentives, and energy consultants also receive incentives. So we'll talk about energy consultants on the next slide. So for developers, we issue all incentives once projects have completed construction and verification. So previously, we've always issued incentives for dwelling units, and that ranges based on the performance of the project. And what you're learning about today now, and what's new in 2016, is incentives for common spaces. So those savings, or those incentives, are based on savings. And also new this year is an incentive to support teams who would like to host a design charrette. So we have kind of a little write-up about that if you're interested, but the project would receive $5,000 for participating in a CMFNH design charrette. So if you're interested, we'll have our contact information up at the end of this slide. Just let us know and we can talk about scheduling a charrette with your project team. Lastly, for developer incentives, we issue an incentive to offset the cost of hiring a rater who is responsible for conducting on-site verification to make sure that the final as-built conditions match kind of what the original energy model represents. So that is a per unit incentive up to $12,000 per project. Next slide. So for energy consultant incentives, we really, I think probably a lot of you on this call are energy consultants. We want you to know we really appreciate the time that you spend going through CMFNH plan review. We know this kind of addition does take, so this addition of working with common spaces might take a little more time, so we want to acknowledge that. Historically, energy consultants have received $50 per unit. Up to 200 units or $10,000. And now we're adding this incentive for unique common spaces, meaning, so an example would be corridors, gym, lobby, laundry. I'll let our team chime in maybe during the questions time if they want to clarify how we're calculating those common space incentives, but the maximum would be $500 per unit for common spaces. Next slide. Okay, so I think we're ready to move on to our panelists today, and I'll mention before we begin, we are recording this presentation, and we'll send everyone a copy of the recording and also a copy of the slide deck via email within a couple days of this webinar. And we really welcome your questions. So you'll see on the sidebar of GoToWebinar, there's a questions panel. So we won't unmute anyone for this session, but if you have a question, please go ahead and enter it into the questions bar. We'll pause a few times throughout the presentation to take questions. And we will read them out on your behalf. So I'll introduce our first panelist, who is Megan Daw, who you've probably worked with. She has been coordinating HERS verification, documentation, and checking in the registry, and also has been a big part of the plan review team for California Multifamily New Homes. In addition to this program work, she also does a lot of work on new code enhancement studies. And was part of the 2016 code team for TRC. So she's going to kind of go through the first part of the presentation for us. So Megan, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks Shannon. Hi everyone, Megan Daw here. So today in our webinar, we'll be first going over what the changes are for modeling for the 2016 program cycle and how that differs from the previous program cycles. This is the first program cycle where we are allowing the non-residential common spaces. We've heard some positive feedback already, and we are equally as excited to have these spaces in our program. We'll then discuss CMFNH performance requirements for these common spaces, as well as provide examples of eligible spaces and go over the program guidelines for modeling these spaces. We'll also provide some examples and leave it open for some questions as well. And lastly, the most important, we'll be talking about some of the incentives that you can be awarded for including these common spaces for your project. All right, next slide. Great. So first, we will be talking about what has changed for 2016 for what spaces we are taking and how we're asking those to be modeled. First, we'll look at what was normal for 2015 and the previous program cycles, and that was that we were only accepting residential spaces, so only those directly conditioned spaces that were the residential dwelling units. Everything else was removed from the model, including any corridors or hallways, anything that was, not a directly related to the dwelling unit was removed. No, non-residential common spaces were accepted. For 2016, everything is still the same for that residential portion. We still are asking that you submit a model that is only residential, just those dwelling units. Everything else is separated out. But instead of just discarding that and not submitting it to us, we're asking that you put all those directly conditioned non-residential common areas into another model and submit that to us separately. And we'll get into the details about how that common area can be modeled, but just wanting to kind of lay this out, that this is the overall picture, that nothing's changed for the residential side. You'll model exactly the same as you had for any of our previous program cycles. Just now we're adding on that you will submit a separate non-residential model. All right, great, next slide. Now to get into what are some of the eligible common spaces. A lot of projects are mixed use. There might be some retail or community multi-purpose buildings. So what can be submitted to CMFNH for this program. And we'll also talk a little bit about what constitutes an indirectly conditioned space and how those are handled in the program. So eligible projects. First, I really wanted to highlight that we are accepting common spaces for currently enrolled projects. So these are projects that enrolled in the program for the 2013 to 2015 cycle. They might be currently under construction or about to start. At the time, we were not accepting common spaces. We have been given approval to look at those projects now, look at any common spaces that they might have, and see if we can, add some additional incentives to your projects. A few criteria for those is that the projects in those particular buildings cannot have finished construction or their field verification, because we do still need to go out and verify the characteristics of those buildings or those spaces, and they must be submitted in the 2013 compliance software. So we know some projects that enrolled in the 2013 to 2015 timeframe might have actually been under 2008 Title 24 for state compliance. You went ahead and developed 2013 compliant models for us and submitted those for the res portion. We are asking the same thing would have to stand for the common spaces. If you have any questions about that, we will be reaching out to project teams over the next couple of weeks about any projects that are currently enrolled. So feel free to reach out to us, or we will be contacting anyone who has a current project in our program. And then, of course, any newly enrolled 2016 CMFNH projects are welcome to submit common spaces. All right, and the eligible common spaces, really the main criteria is that they have to be for tenant use only. So no retail space or space that would be leased out that is not for tenant use. They have to be directly conditioned and receive residential utility service. And if a portion of your common space or your non-residential space is actually receiving commercial utility, has a commercial utility hookup, we can look into the opportunities with savings by design. So it's always best to just lay out everything to whoever your contact is on the project, and we'll sort of figure out where's the best place for those spaces to enroll. Some common examples of these spaces that we are typically seeing are gym facilities, community rooms, community kitchens, multi-purpose rooms, computer labs, and leasing or management offices, which are different than leased office space. So those leasing management offices are actually for use for the tenants and the management of that multifamily building. And of course, this is just an example of some common spaces. These are not the only ones we'll accept. So it's we will look at the plans and we'll look at your models and kind of work that out with each project team. Great, next slide. And to touch briefly on the indirectly conditioned space, there's a lot on this slide. I did include the exact definition of how 2013 Title 24 defines indirectly conditioned space. And kind of overall, the summary is that an indirectly conditioned space has more heat transfer between the indirectly conditioned space and conditioned space than it does with unconditioned or outside space. There's kind of a, Title 24 has its definition about how you exactly show that. It's not exactly black and white, and I'm sure most of you have, sort of dealt with this in your models. Title 24 does include indirectly conditioned space as part of the total conditioned floor area for a project. For CMFNH, we are not accepting indirectly conditioned spaces. So when sending your common space models and your residential models, anything that is not directly conditioned must be removed. And this follows similar modeling guidelines we've had for previous program cycles. So nothing different there. And some examples of what we typically see as indirectly conditioned spaces: corridors that are exhaust only and might have one wall that's adjacent to the exterior of the building, janitorial closets, equipment rooms, other rooms that aren't directly conditioned and are adjacent to the outside. Again, we don't accept these for the program for CMFNH. And that wraps up the first introduction, and we'll take a pause for any questions and then move on to the actual modeling guidelines.
Great. So let me look through our questions. We actually had one that I think you just answered, which is indirectly conditioned spaces, kind of clarifying whether or not those are eligible for incentives. So I think the answer is no, please don't include those in the model. Do you want to add anything to that, Megan?
Nope, I think that we answered that one already. And if somebody does have follow-up questions, feel free and we can respond to them offline.
Cool. Okay. Still seeing a few more, so let's see. Okay. So let me read our next question out. So if a space does not meet our criteria for like an eligible common space, how would you ask an energy consultant to treat that space in the model? Like, would that affect the whole project's participation?
Great. So I want to clarify what they mean by do not meet the criteria as eligible. Either it's not an eligible space, it's retail, or it receives commercial utility services. Any of those spaces, if it's not something we accept into the program, we ask that it's not included in the model. So the model would only, the model would only include the directly conditioned spaces that are for tenant use. If the question is more about, whether it doesn't meet the performance requirements.
I think that's where the question is going, yeah.
Great. Then if it doesn't meet the performance requirements, so all of the common spaces should be modeled. I don't think we're allowing you to kind of pick and choose which common spaces you want to model. It's anything that would be eligible based on the criteria that it's directly conditioned, is for tenant use, and receives residential services. Those should all be modeled. We can sort of work with projects if there's some kind of extreme case, but for now I think that all of those common spaces need to be included in the model.
So I think we maybe address this later, but if the common space as a whole is like far below the compliance kind of entry point, there might be an option to exclude it. Is that correct?
I think actually we will say that probably not an exception to exclude it, because it's kind of the same as, you know, the whole building. If it's a whole building model, kind of all of those, a whole building residential, everything needs to meet compliance. We could potentially look at it as a space by space performance. So there is, we would have to look at each project. I don't think we have kind of addressed that in particular question. I think originally
I can maybe clarify too, like, so would you look at the common space as a whole and make sure that that qualifies, or would you maybe even be looking at it like a laundry area or a lobby, and if that space is below below the compliance entry point, but another space kind of makes up for it, is that balance acceptable? Kind of the space as a whole versus each individual space complying?
Yeah, so we'd look at the model as a whole and all of the common spaces together for that particular building. So all the common spaces in one building would be modeled together in one model. And we would look at that, the performance of that on a whole.
Cool. So we've got a few questions that are coming in on this particular topic. I think some of it will become a little bit clearer as we go through the rest of the presentation, because as we'll address, there are some different compliance thresholds for common spaces than there are for the residential spaces, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so this might be cleared up. We are going to get our next section into the actual modeling of these spaces, and this might address some of those questions. If
Cool.
there are still additional questions after, then we can maybe address those after we talk about the modeling portion.
Great. I think that's a good idea. And I just want to chime in with kind of more of the policy decision making behind incorporating common spaces into the program. I know a lot of you have probably coordinated with both California Multifamily New Homes and Savings by Design, and the intent of allowing CMFNH to count for common spaces and provide incentives for common spaces is to help project teams to minimize the amount of kind of interaction they're having to do with multiple programs, and also just to look at the multifamily building space as a whole, kind of a whole building approach versus kind of choppy. So yeah, I think we're ready to move on. And Megan, do you want to introduce our next panelist?
Great. So next up is Ritesh, and he is our new technical manager and plan review manager for CMFNH. And he comes to us with a background of commercial energy efficiency and modeling with various simulation softwares. And he'll be discussing the actual modeling guidelines and giving some examples.
Thanks, Megan. Hi, everyone. So in the following slides, we will be talking about various project scenarios, what is the modeling guidance for each scenario, and the program compliance requirement for those scenarios. So the next slide you will see is, we call it scenario 1, which is a low-rise residential building having a common space attached. And when we say a common space attached, means the common space is within the building. Also, the common space should have an area which is less than or equal to 20% of the total conditioned floor area of the building. If we have a common space which falls in this category, that will fall under scenario 1. The modeling guidance for this particular scenario requires, number 1, a separate model needs to be provided for the common spaces. Second, the energy consultants had the option to use residential Title 24 performance calculation as the simulation option. The lighting calculations, the lighting for these common spaces have to be modeled separately, as this is a statewide requirement, and this has been the requirement in the past as well. So nothing changes for the lighting. To get more information of why we are requiring this particular performance calculation, we can refer to the residential manual section 8.4. Also, when the energy consultants, reuse residential Title 24 performance as their simulation option, it allows the baseline to use, the residential equipment. Now I will jump off the presentation to go over some examples that falls under scenario 1. Give me a second. So this is a typical example that we see all the time, where the energy consultants submit a one model for both the residential space types as well as common space types. And the one thing that to note is these common spaces are conditioned. So if it is an unconditioned, the CMFNH program doesn't give incentives for those space types. Now, when you look at this particular model in detail, you'll see that the residential HVAC system serves all these dwelling units, and the non-residential HVAC system serve all these space types. You will notice one thing is the occupancy for each space type is different. As if you look at the dwelling unit, every occupancy is multifamily. Now, when we as plan reviewers, look at the model, one of the comments that we send out to the energy consultant is we require separate model. If you want to get incentives for the common spaces, a separate model needs to be provided. I'll give you an example of the same project that we got back from the energy consultant after we send out the comment. Is you'll see that the same building HVAC system, but it only serves the residential space types. It doesn't have any non-residential space types. He also provided a different model for the same building, which has all these non-residential space types. One of the requirements for all the scenarios that we will be talking today is when you take a common space and model it, using a separate model, for each space type, the occupancy needs to be changed to multifamily. So that is something that we have to keep in mind, all the energy consultants, that we cannot go back to using an occupancy of like stairs for this particular zone. To get the incentive for the common space, they have to go with multifamily as the occupancy for all these space types. Now I'll go back to the PowerPoint. This is scenario 1. Scenario 2 is again a low-rise residential building which has a common space that can be attached to the building, or it can be detached. It can be like a standalone building. If the common space is attached to the building, the requirement is the area of the common space needs to be greater than 20% of the total conditioned floor area of the building. The modeling guidance for this scenario is, number 1, again, we need a separate model for the common spaces. Second, when doing the simulation, the energy consultants are required to use non-residential Title 24 performance calculation. This is where it gets different than scenario 1, because the simulation option is non-res as compared to Title 24 res for scenario 1. Again, why it's required, you can refer to section 8.4. One thing that we have to keep in mind is, if it is always model the non-residential buildings as non-residential. Now, when the energy consultants choose the non-residential Title 24 as the simulation option, the baseline assumptions for the equipment also changes. If you remember, like in scenario 1, when they use residential Title 24, it allows the baseline to use a baseline like residential equipment. In scenario 2, the assumptions will change, and it will use a non-residential equipment. The next slide, we talk about scenario 3. So scenario 3 is a high-rise residential building where they can have a common space either attached to the building or detached to the building. It doesn't have a requirement of the total area because it's a high-rise building. It has to be modeled as using a non-residential Title 24 performance calculation. That is the modeling guidance for a high-rise building. Again, why the thing that we have to remember is all high-rise building projects, they have to use non-residential performance calculation while doing the simulation. I'll again jump off the presentation to show you an example of a high-rise project that we got and how we kind of address this issue of common spaces. So this is how the project was submitted to us. You'll notice that you'll have the HVAC system. The ACR1 serves lobby, apartments, and certain other zones which are non-residential space types. And it has, it's a high-rise building. So when we looked at the model, one of the comments again we sent out to the energy consultant was we require a separate model for each for different space types. We got the model back from the energy consultant, and you will notice that under the ACR1 there is no zone which was previously for the non-residential space types. Unfortunately, for this particular project, when they separated out the model, the common spaces didn't comply. So as Megan said previously, that if your common space, once you do the model and it doesn't comply with what the program requires, it's not going to be a problem. We will still give the incentives for the residential space types. Going back to the presentation. The next slide is, if you have any questions, let us know for based on the examples and the scenarios that we talked about.
Yeah, I think we have a few questions, Ritesh.
Okay.
Let's see.
Shani, can I circle back on one of the earlier questions, and I think that Ritesh kind of touched on here.
Absolutely.
If you do separate out that model, that non-residential portion, and we're finding it's not complying, and there might be, one particular space size bringing down that model, or bringing down the performance, we can look at, only enrolling certain portions of the common space, just like we do for the residential units. If you submit unit by unit, we can enroll only some of the units that comply, and it doesn't disqualify the project as a whole. Same will go for the common spaces.
Great. I think that does answer the question. So now, I'll just go back through. I think some of these questions we'll just review in a little more detail, Ritesh. Do you want to go back to scenario number 1, and I'll ask this question?
Sure.
So can you just confirm how should folks model dwelling units in terms of occupancy type under this scenario?
It will be modeled as multifamily.
Yep. I think feel free to chime back in if you want us to clarify that response. The person that wrote that one in. Okay, next question. Okay, do you have an example of how you'd like the central domestic hot water systems or boilers to be modeled when there might be only one system providing hot water throughout the residential and non-residential common spaces?
So yeah, Megan and I, we talked about this as one of the scenarios, and what we kind of have not decided, we thought of is we will be prorating it, the system capacity based on the area it's serving. Correct me if I'm wrong, Megan.
Sure. Yeah, we have. We'll work with projects when that scenario comes up. It's similar for, we prorate it by number of dwelling units when it's splitting up to the residential, and then when we get to the non-residential portion, when we need to divvy that up, we'll work with each project based on the areas it's serving and the size of the system.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, here's another question. How should folks model corridors that are totally within a conditioned space, but the surface is only tied to residential?
We will be talking about that in the next few slides, so
Okay.
maybe we can hold off to that question.
Yes. And that same person had a question about splitting heat pumps between res and non-residential space. I guess, I mean, those are heat pumps serving individual spaces, or are they central heat pumps? Maybe you want to address if it was kind of more of a central system. I think, yeah, okay, central. So I think that's kind of similar to the domestic hot water question with the prorated to the units.
Yep.
Ritesh or Megan, do you want to address that same issue with HVAC?
That's correct, that they have to prorate it based on the number of units and the area for the common spaces.
Yep. Great. Okay, next question. Okay, can you just go to scenario 3 again?
Okay.
So just a clarification question. Oops, I just closed it up. Okay, since it's a all residential calculation, what is the need? Why is there a need to create a separate model for residential units?
I'm not sure if I quite understand the question.
I think I get it. So it is all being calculated using the non-residential Title 24 performance. This is for why we're asking you to separate it out is still for our program purposes. We know it might be one additional step for you. It provides our process to go a lot faster when we're looking at the model, so we're still asking that they be separated out even though they're both using the non-residential calculations.
Great. I think that's a good response, Megan. I want to be careful of time, so I think let's keep going, and then we do have a few more questions. Let's hold those and take those at the end. So Ritesh, if you wanna keep going.
Okay, thank you. Okay, in the next slides we'll be talking about the modeling guidance when it comes to walls and program compliance and incentives. So wall modeling guidance, let's say we have a building which has a corridor which is indirectly conditioned or which is not directly conditioned. What happens to the surface? That means that is the wall which separates the dwelling unit from the corridor. It is important to model that particular wall in the model, since there will be heat loss or heat gain between those zones, and there are various ways to model that wall. In the program, we have seen that almost every energy consultant models the wall separately when it comes to unconditioned zones or indirectly conditioned zones. We didn't have the time to pull out all the options, so what we did was we picked up the top two, the two options that we see most of the times being used by the energy consultant. The first option is they can input the wall as an interior wall, and the software will not register any solar gain. That's one option. Second, if you select the wall but you don't select select the next zone which it is adjacent to, The software treats it as adiabatic. And both these options I will be talking more in the next two slides, one for each option, with the help of some architectural drawings. So in this particular slide, you'll see that you have a corridor which is on one side attached to a dwelling unit, on the other side it is exposed to the outer surface. What we have seen energy consultants do is model the walls as interior walls. So the software doesn't pick up any solar heat gain for these walls. That's one way to model those walls. Second slide, you'll have a corridor which is completely enclosed within a conditioned space. As you can see, this particular corridor has dwelling units on each side, and it's actually not exposed to the exterior surface. What we have seen in the past is energy consultants model the walls as interior walls and make this zone as adjacent to none. So that kind of makes these walls, the software treats them as adiabatic. So that was one of the questions that came in the previous slides. That might be helpful if you look at this drawing. So this is what we have seen in the past, and again, these are not the only options that the way you can model it, but we are just giving you the option that we have seen come up most of the times with the energy consultants. Moving to the next slide. This particular slide just talks about the program compliance and incentives. So for a non-residential performance calculation, we have to remove the indoor lighting energy use to determine the program compliance. And this is what we have been doing it in the past as well. So nothing changes here. And again, what if once you model the common spaces and that particular model doesn't comply with what the program requires? That's not going to be a deal breaker. We will still enroll the residential portion of the project. And the table in this slide kind of gives you an example. If the common space is modeled as residential, the program requires it to be 15% better than the 2013 Title 24 code. And if a common space is modeled as non-residential, the program requires it to be 10% better than the code. And these are the incentives that is given out from the program point of view. One underlining thing is always model the common spaces in high-rise residential building as non-residential. That is scenario 3 that we talked about just some time back. The next slide, we'll take some questions, if you have any.
Yes, we do have a few questions. Let me kind of read through them.
Okay.
Okay. So kind of a process question in terms of if you have a project that you're ready to submit, how should that project team work with us to figure out, for example, splitting up central systems? I'll just chime in by saying kind of the first step is to work with one of our outreach team members just to kind of give them a sense of your project, and then they'll kind of loop you in with the appropriate kind of technical support person to figure out how to do that split and any other kind of technical questions that you have. So we'll have our contact info on the last slide before we wrap up. But you can write to info@cmfnh.com and just say, hey, I've got a project, and give them a little bit of info about your project. And they'll kind of walk you through the next steps, and you can say, I sat in on this webinar and I'd like to kind of talk with one of your technical team about common spaces. You can also touch base with Megan or Ritesh, and actually we don't have their contact info on this slide, but we'll send it out in the in the email, our follow-up email. Do you want to add anything to that, Megan or Ritesh? I'll assume it's good.
Yeah, just if there are more questions, feel free to follow up.
Yeah, I'd say if you have a particular project that you're thinking about, I would go the route of getting started with that info@cmfnh.com email, and then they'll tie you in with a kind of a technical person to answer other questions. Okay, next question. So if when modeling common areas, if there aren't any dwelling units, but we set the occupancy type to multifamily, that'll trigger a requirement to enter dwelling units. Should we make one dwelling unit for all the common areas or one dwelling unit per common space?
I believe it should go one dwelling unit per common space. So if we look back at the example model that Ritesh was showing, let's say you have a community room, that would be considered one dwelling unit if you're going the route of modeling it as as residential. Again, that's an option, so we're not requiring that you do this. It does probably benefit you to do that if it's low-rise multifamily because it does change the baseline assumptions. So if you have a community space, that would be one dwelling unit. If your next is a computer room, that would be another dwelling unit. So the number of dwelling units for common space would add up to the number of common spaces you are enrolling. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, feel free to follow up if you want us to clarify. Okay. So it's a little bit tricky because I think you guys addressed a lot of the well modeling questions in the separate section. So I guess I would say if you still have a question about wall modeling, maybe enter it in again and clarify it if you can, so I'll know that you still have that question. Let's see. Can you elaborate what the process behind prorating central kind of savings out or energy use between common spaces and units? What's that process like?
We haven't laid out a particular process as of now because we'll be dealing it on a project by project basis. Correct me if I'm wrong, Megan.
Yes. So for the hot water for DHW, that is we would look at number of dwelling units, and then for the common spaces, if there is a DHW system that's serving the common spaces, we'd have to work with each project and kind of see, what is the exact use for those spaces. And then if it's an HVAC system, I think we would prorate that more on conditioned floor area.
Yes. And of course, we'll do it, as Megan said, it's kind of a case-by-case issue, and Ritesh also said. So probably we'll be kind of consulting with you on a project-by-project basis. Okay. Can you explain why we ask folks to remove lighting from non-residential space?
Sure. So for our program for CMFNH, we're not allowed to incentivize on lighting. So when we are determining our compliance for the program, if it is a non-residential high-rise multifamily project, we remove that line item from the compliance calculation to sort of then calculate a new compliance total. We know that model and forms still need to be done for state compliance. They're just not something that's included in our program. Indoor lighting is not.
Great. Thanks, Megan. Do you want to talk a little bit about, I don't know if you've done runs to compare on occupancy, but do you feel like you can speak to how changing the occupancy type to multifamily might change the calculations?
Sure. Ritesh, do you want me to take that one, or?
Yeah, you can. Do you want me to go back to the model, or?
Sure. So when we were first looking at common spaces for multifamily, when you model it as non-residential, if you actually were to use the occupancy for that space type, it then starts comparing your proposed area to a non-residential building, and mostly an office building. So the equipment that is assumed in the standard design for that space type, it was something like a VAV system, or something that it kind of changes depending on how large your project is, but they're pretty efficient systems that are assumed for something like an office building, maybe retail. When we look at projects that are enrolling in CMFNH, and as you're sure many projects you're working on that are low-rise multifamily, those common areas are in reality more likely to use equipment that is more applicable to a residential setting. So heat pumps or split AC, something like that. When you compare those to what a standard design building is using, we were seeing that a lot of times we are getting energy penalties, especially on the space heating and space cooling, just because the baseline assumptions were so much more efficient than what was being installed in the proposed building. So CEC has also identified this, and does allow, if your common non-residential space is below 20% of total CFA, that's the scenario 1, you can assume the whole building is going to be using the same modeling assumptions of the residents, of whatever is the majority, 80% or more of the building. For our cases, that is the low-rise multifamily, so you can use that as your baseline assumptions for all of those common spaces, and that usually is much more favorable for the performance calculation results.
So really the outcome is that, or the biggest reason that we did it was we found that the non-residential space, or considering occupancy type as not multifamily, really negatively impacted the savings and incentive. Is that right?
Correct.
For the most part? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and on the same note, I'll give you an example. I'm working with an energy consultant for where, they're proposing to install heat pumps for space conditioning and domestic hot water purposes. And it's a high-rise building, around 23 or 25 floors. But when they put their system in the model, they're getting negative penalty, like they're getting a penalty, heavy penalty. The reason is your standard system is a chill water system, and our chillers are in part load conditions operate way efficiently than any other system available in the market. So that's a drawback. That's why we are proposing that you change the occupancy to multifamily.
Great. I think you guys did a great job answering that question. So I think a lot of the questions that folks are asking are a little bit specific. I think I might hold some of them to answer via email. So we'll be following up with some of you offline. I think we're ready to shift into our final slide, unless Megan or Ritesh, you have anything else that you want to add to that discussion?
I'm good.
Great.
Oh,
So I'll do
nothing
one
coming
more
up.
plug. So we hope that you're all here because you are hoping to participate in the program this year, if you're not already. And as you're probably familiar, we have deadlines each year. So I think right now our current deadline that we're stating is that projects have to complete plan review, so meaning they have to submit all their documentation and give us a few weeks for review and address any comments by the end of, end of October. And so that is coming up. I mean, that means you probably need to try to be getting everything in by the end of September so that we have enough time to do review. So if you have a project that you're thinking about, maybe the energy models aren't quite ready, but it's on your radar. If it's permitting under the 2013 code, please tell us about it as soon as possible, just so we can kind of get a sense for what our plan review volume is, so we can know, like, how do we need to staff appropriately to make sure we're doing plan review in a timely manner. So you can write to info@cmfnh.com and just say, hey, I've got a project, and tell us the number of units, tell us when you expect to have semi-final energy models, or if you want to talk to one of our staff about kind of a technical question to boost your compliance, or if you want to talk about common space. I think that's probably the easiest way to move forward, and we'll direct your question to the right person. So yeah, we really look forward to seeing your projects this year, and thanks again for joining us for this webinar. There will be a little survey that pops up when you close out, and you can give us some feedback on the presentation, and you can also indicate if you want someone from the program to follow up about a project, so feel free to use that option if you want us to touch base with you. And I'll just use a minute to thank our panelists, Megan and Ritesh, and just acknowledge it is really hard to kind of think on your feet and address really kind of specific technical questions. So I want to really acknowledge that and thank them for sharing with us today. So I will let you all go, and have a great rest of your day, everyone. We'll send you the recording and slide deck in a couple days. Thanks everyone.